Now you lived through the Depression. Can you tell us what it was like a little bit, and the way you saw it? It was, was it?
Relatively, we had it relatively easy during the Depression. But my daddy had, by that time, I think there was 50 employees left at the factory making last and so on. And the one thing he did, everybody had to have a garden. Now, we had lots of land and so on. We had our own garden, which took care of our family. And he would take others. And I remember one fellow we had there had 5 kids. And he was an Italian family, first generation. And he made them raise potatoes and so on. And if you look, my dad looked at the kids, they were skinny as hell one winter. And then he found Milo was making vodka out of the potatoes. He was mad that day. And so on. But things like that. But we raised just about everything we ate. I remember like cupboard squash, Christ, that wouldn't run out till February and stuff like that. But my mom would can. We'd take and raise chickens. And of course, there was no refrigeration in those days. We had an ice box. And so but we did very, very well. In other words, we were always fine that way. So we did well. But the big thing about the Depression, everybody helped everyone else. I can't remember any stealing or any problems like that. Fellows would come through and they'd be hungry and so on. Well, they needed a meal, but they wanted to do something. And my dad or my mom would invent something for them to do probably and give them a meal. So, but there was law and order then. They respected each other.
Did you sit around the dinner table as a family at night?
We had, my mom was an excellent cook all the way, and we did. We had, she always had a good breakfast for us. Then on Sunday was a big meal, but we always had a good meal in the evening. Always, my mom was a good. She used to make all her own bread and stuff like that. It was very good.
So you remember the smells?
Yeah, I mean, it was always, the kitchen was great. I learned to do dishes very early. In fact, I'm still a pretty good dishwasher and a dishwasher. But I like to wash the dishes before I put them in the dishwasher.
Now, when you were a kid or a teenager, and somebody said, "Okay, what do you want to be when you grow up?" What was your ambition in your life?
Probably from the time I was maybe 12 on, I wanted to fly an airplane. I mean, that was it. There was nothing else.
Did you do model airplanes and stuff like that?
No, I never built any model airplanes.
Once you had your own machine shops,
I was always working in the machine shop because remember, I first started on automotive. Yeah.
Now, what did you do right after high school? What did you do?
After high school, of course, right when I finished there, I blended. I really didn't have any time because I stayed right on in and through. And at that time, I took aeronautics, and Mass Ed paid for all of that. It was a very great. Otherwise, my God, I don't think I could afford it all. They gave you the textbooks and everything else. And normally at Northeastern, they had, in fact, my cousin had gone through that. That's why I kind of selected that. It was an option. There were 3 others. But what happened was you normally went 3 years, and then your 4th year, you would go out, like he went with Pratt & Whitney. That's how he ended up there on the job. Well, I elected to take and go with the airlines to get my airline transport rating. And my selection was Colonial Airlines and American Airlines and Eastern Airlines. And I went to land at Eastern because my daddy and Eddie Rickenbacker were shirt-tail friends. They had Christmas cards and stuff like that since World War I. So I went down there. But the only thing that happened, of course, here's war coming along by that time. So I got 2 years formal classroom. And then they sent me down what they call a military transport division at Eastern down in Atlanta. Now by that time I had my instrument rating, I had everything. I had a lot of time. And so on. But anyhow, I went down there, and Larry Paps was the fellow that ran it, and I was the chief. And so anyhow, I went through that. I lived in the YMCA, I remember, down there, and got checked out in the DC-3 and went through. They had a formal ground school, and they had one of the first Link trainers down there at the time. And I remember that was fantastic. And I got down there though, and I was supposed to take and go through all the classes, but about probably a week later I was instructing on Stinson. They had some SR-7s down there, I think 2 of those, with Lycoming engines, 300 horsepower Lycoming. But they had one with a 450 and SR-9F. And boy, I tell you, you could hear that sucker 10 or 20 miles around. And I got to instruct in that. And then all the way they had a Boeing 247 there, Boeing, and that had the Pratt & Whitney. Well, it had the 1340s in it, and it had Smith controllable props to position, and I got instructing on that. I thought that was quite an airplane. And of course, that had been an earlier airliner.
So that you were basically living in a time, the most exciting, one of the...
Really, I tell you, you know, life is fate, time, and circumstance, no matter who you cut it. You don't know to whom and where you're going to be born. You don't know the economics, the geography, and all the other things of growing up. And I was so fortunate. I can remember, of course, the horse and wagon, and the trucks in Boston were all electric powered with hard rubber tires and chain drives and so on. And the only Mack trucks came in about that time. Oh boy, that big old gasoline Mack truck, that was everything. They were the first big trucks I remember. Of course, they came in about 24, 25, but there were very few of them. But during the 30s, they started to get quite a few Mack trucks, I remember. But I liked automotive first, but then, of course, my daddy, when I started to fly with him, everything changed.
So you got a chance to really, during the golden age of aviation, where it was really growing, different kinds of planes.
I really did, and I had this beautiful Waco, that I say the Waco 10 that we had rebuilt, and they were Boston with a lot of wealthy people at the time, and I remember kids around there that God had their daddies had bought them these big fancy airplanes. They had the big Waco cabins and the Beech Stagger wings and so on, and all different airplanes. And you know, I envied them in a way, but really then I didn't. Because I think I enjoyed what I had more. But I got to fly all their airplanes because they wanted to fly my Waco. So everything just worked out good. And
Now, how did the military come into your life?
the military came into my life. Of course, my daddy was there. And he wanted me to, of course, to ROTC. But there was an age problem, remember, all the way through. And I remember when, of course, I flew illegally, actually, with everybody knowing it, on a student permit. And then I got my private. And then, however, I was still not old enough to get my commercial and my flight instructor's rating. And I remember Roy Keeley came down. His wife had died that summer, came down one Thanksgiving. And he was talking to my dad, and he says, I think it's time for he gets his commercial and his insulin rating. And my dad said, well, look, Roy, he's not old enough, you know that. And he says, well, I think he is. And he said, let's see, you went to Doc Andrews, didn't you? Let me see your physical. And I'm damned if it was 1918 on it, see? So they put me there, and that really changed my life. I was tall, and of course, I was way ahead for my age. And then, with that, of course, the ROTC, I was able to get into that. They almost washed me up because I had flat feet, I remember, in there. But then the minute they found out I was Mass Ed, then I went right through. And then I learned to march, of course, at Devens, which was north of Boston, and the Army base there. And my dad was very proud of that, I remember when I got into that.
So why did you pick that form of service?
Because of my daddy. There was no question about that. Yeah.
And they didn't have an Air Force in those days. It was part of the Army, right?
No, it was all Army Air Corps. It was Army Air Corps at that time. And of course, my daddy had been in the National Guard, and they had 5 airplanes in Boston. That was a cinder dump. The city of Boston dumped cinders there for years and years, and it was almost a mile square of that, and they put a wall to keep the seawater from coming over. So you just landed into the wind in those days there. There were no actually runways, but it was good, and they plowed it during the winter. And we had American Airlines in there first, well, Northeast, and they were using, they started earlier, but they were using Lockheed Electric just before World War II. Yeah.
Did you ever have any close calls flying in those early days?
Not really. I was fortunate. The Waco, I remember one time I had an engine start, and I landed on a homemade golf course, and I got out, and one of the pins on the overhead, and I remember I had a jackknife, I whittled a peg out of a birch tree and put it in and flew it home. And that's the only time I can remember. Let's see. Yeah, I had an absolute engine quit. Now, another time, we had an Eagle Rock, which was made up in Colorado. It had a big Wright, the same engine that Lindbergh had the mags in front. I guess it was 200 and some odd horsepower. And we used to tow signs. And one morning I used Griffin all white shoe polish I was towing. It was a pretty good banner. And it was marathon day in Boston, the 26 mile. And the wind was blowing pretty good out of the north. Well, anyhow, I had flown this quite a bit, and I'd been taught, that was the longest banner I guess I had pulled. But anyhow, I was fly around in Boston. So I'd been around, and I came back in and landed. Christ, there was oil all over the place. And one of the linemen, I had not been maintaining it, and one of the linemen said, that's an oil-throwing bastard, all the way through. So I didn't put it in, and he said, well, I'll check the oil and so on. And so I fueled up, and I took off. And by then, the wind was blowing pretty well. So I got over the Reedville racetrack, which was near Boston, right in that, and boy, I wasn't hardly going forward at all. And boy, I tell you, I just did that a little bit, and I looked at my oil pressure. I didn't have an oil temperature gauge. My oil pressure was going down, and I dumped the banner, and the only thing was down there was a Reedville racetrack, which normally, boy, you wouldn't, but the wind was probably blowing 30 mile an hour. So I went in and I made a perfect landing on that. I didn't cut the engine off completely, I just pulled it back into idle, and I didn't use it, however, and I just stopped practically the time I landed. Well, pretty soon around, the police came out there and thought it was a prank or something. So I had to convince them that I'd been banner towing. I was worried about the banner and so on. Well, they were very helpful when they found out what happened. So we took and I called the people that owned the airplane and so on, and they came and we had it probably, this would have probably been, I guess 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and probably 9 o'clock at night we had that all apart and back at the Canton Airport. And then we found out what happened was, and it was, I should have checked it. I trusted this fellow. Boy, I tell you, it really taught me a lesson. I got hell for it. And so what happened was, where you interconnect the cylinders in the bottom, they had a crack in it. And what was happening, it got worse and worse and worse. And of course I lost all my oil. But fortunately I did not hurt the engine, thank God. And the engine had very, very little time since overhaul. So everything worked out, and 3 days later we were back in business. But that was the first real forced landing that I considered a true forced landing. And I was fortunate, remember that day, if I hadn't had the wind, boy oh boy. So I'd have gone down, I'd had trouble.